Now let's turn our attention to the requirements that have to be met in order to construct a confidence interval for a population proportion. And after that, we'll talk about how we actually use the calculator to find that confidence interval. So, first of all, the variable must be qualitative. Or remember, the other word for that is categorical. And there can only be two possible outcomes. Also, the sample has to either be given to be or reasonably assumed to be a simple random sample. So either the problem has to tell us that it was a simple random sample, or we can assume that that's the case. How can we assume that it was a simple random sample? Well, if the sample was conducted by a reputable polling agency or a scientific study, that kind of thing, we can assume that those are simple random samples. Now, this next one is a little weird. This one is n times p hat times 1 minus p hat in parentheses has to be greater than or equal to 10. So remember, n is the sample size, p hat is the sample proportion, and 1 minus p hat is just 1 minus the sample proportion. That has to be greater than or equal to 10. This is what is called the normality condition. Essentially, we need to check to make sure that we can use normal, that our distribution is normally distributed. And the last one is that our sample size has to be less than 5% of the population. So lowercase n is sample size, capital N is population size. And this is what we call the independence condition. We want to make sure that all the individuals were independent, their selection, as opposed to dependent. So remember all that stuff from chapter 5, independent versus dependent probabilities? Here you go. It's back to haunt us. So how do we actually construct the confidence interval on the calculator? Well, we do it this way. We hit the stat button. We go over to the tests menu and we go down to option A, as in the letter A as in apple, which says 1 prop Z test. Nope, interval, Z int, sorry. So, one thing I always note, the prop stands for proportion, and the int stands for interval. So confidence interval for a proportion, prop Z int. And this takes 3 things to be input. It takes X, which is the number of individuals who have that characteristic, whatever it is we're talking about. it takes n, which is the sample size, and it takes something called C level, which is our level of confidence. So let's see an example and how we use it. In the Parent Teen Cell Phone Survey conducted by Princeton Survey Research Associates International, 800 randomly sampled 16 to 17-year-olds living in the U.S. were asked whether they have ever used their cell phone to text while driving. Of the 800 surveyed, 272 indicated that they text while driving. Obtain a 95% confidence interval. So this is what it wants us to do. For the proportion of 16 to 17-year-olds who text while driving. So first of all, what is the sample proportion? Well, that's p hat, which is x over n. X is the number that said they text while driving, that's 272. And n is the total number surveyed, which is 800. So our p hat is 0.34. Now we need to verify that those four requirements are met. Is the variable qualitative with only two possible outcomes? Yes. What are the two outcomes? Either they do text while they drive, or they do not text while they drive. Can we reasonably assume, or is the sample given to be a simple random sample? Well, it says 800 randomly sampled, and since it's conducted by a research company, we can assume that it is a simple random sample. Okay, what about n times p hat times 1 minus p hat? Is that greater than or equal to 10? Well, let's find out. N is 800. P hat is 0.34. And then 1 minus 0.34 for 1 minus p hat. And that equals 179.52. That is definitely greater than 10. So yes, that requirement's met. And is the sample size less than 5% of the population size? Well, we're talking about surveying teenagers in the United States, and it said we surveyed 800 of them. The whole population of the U.S. is somewhere around 350 million. So I'm going to say that yes, we can assume that 800 teenagers is less than 5% of all the teenagers in this country. So now we can finally use the calculator to get the confidence interval estimate. So that's going to be 1 prop z test. X is 272. N is 800. And our confidence level is 95%, so 0.95. Now, let's talk about how the calculator gives us an answer. So we're going to hit Stat. We're going to go over to Tests. And we're going to pick option A, which is pretty far down there. 1 prop z int. Do not get A confused with number 5. Number 5 says 1 prop z test. For confidence intervals, we need 1 prop z int. So we hit enter, X was 272, hit enter. N was 800, and our confidence level is 0.95, which happens to already be in here. Then highlight calculate and only hit enter once. So what do we see on our screen? We see two numbers in parentheses that are separated by a comma. The first one is our lower bound. The second one is our upper bound. We also see the second line gives us our sample proportion p hat, and the third line just tells us what our sample size was again. So we're going to write this down rounded to 3 decimal places because that's what we agree on for proportions. So 0.307 to 0.373 when we round. So we get 0.307 to 0.373. Now the other way we could write that is to write it out as an inequality. So the lower bound is less than the population proportion, which is less than the upper bound. So what this compound inequality says is the thing in the middle, the population proportion, is sandwiched between the two numbers on either side. So how do we interpret that? Here's how we interpret this. We are 95% confident that the proportion of 16 to 17-year-old Americans who have texted while driving is between 0.307 and 0.373. So this number is always your level of confidence. And these two numbers are always your bounds. So your lower bound and your upper bound. Now, it's very important to note that a 95% confidence level does not mean that there's a 90% probability the parameter lies between the lower and upper bounds. So pretend we take 200 samples and use those to construct 200 different confidence intervals. A 95% confidence level means we would expect 95% of the samples, or if we multiply 0.95 times 200, would be 190. So we would expect 190 out of 200 samples to contain the true value of the population parameter, and the rest of the samples would not contain the population parameter. So the rest of the samples would be 200 minus 190, or 10 samples. Okay, we'll talk some more about this. We'll do another example in the next video.